Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Robert Altman and the Elaboration of Hollywood Storytelling by Mark Minett, narrated by Runnette. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to illustrations and figures present in the print and e-book formats of this book. About the companion website: www.oup.com/US/Robert Altman Hollywood Storytelling. Oxford has created a website to accompany Robert Altman and the Elaboration of Hollywood Storytelling. Materials that cannot be made available in a book, namely illustrative video clips, are provided here. The listener is encouraged to consult this resource in conjunction with each chapter. Introduction. Robert Altman's death in 2006 brought an end to a remarkable filmmaking journey that spanned 6 decades. Several months prior, he received an honorary award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Altman had been nominated for Best Director 5 times by the Academy, first for MASH in 1970, and finally for the 2001 film Gosford Park. He had, though, never won, a fact that would seem to confirm his status as a maverick, both part of and apart from Hollywood. The Academy's announcement of his award framed it as a recognition of a career that has repeatedly reinvented the art form and inspired filmmakers and audiences alike. Anodyne as it may seem, this plaudit suggests an important perspective, frequently absent from the extant critical literature on the filmmaker. The dominant critical position presents Altman's oeuvre as a rejection, a modernist movement away from Hollywood practice and toward a democratization of the screen, upending the inherently conservative ideological work of Hollywood storytelling. A minority position, less concerned with Altman per se than with the Hollywood mode of filmmaking within which he worked, proposes that Altman, along with his Hollywood Renaissance peers, assimilated art cinema techniques, harnessing the innovations of European auteurs, but doing so largely in service to the standard aims of the Hollywood cinema. Both positions, though to different extents, overstate the stakes and underestimate Hollywood's capacity for meaningfully accommodating innovation. Both accounts, furthermore, misapprehend Altman's formal strategies, and, to varying degrees, fail to consider what the Academy acknowledges, that Altman's long career involved repeated reinvention. Altman did not reject Hollywood. This is a plot that is best understood as serving the purposes of the auteurism industry, which thrives on career-encompassing accounts focused on uncovering a filmmaker's core expressive preoccupations and assessing the ideological implications of any novel uses of cinematic form. Altman's work, though, is also not wholly assimilable to classical Hollywood. He did not tell the same old stories in the same ways for the same old purposes, simply adding an arty gloss appropriated from European art cinema. In contrast to sweeping generalizations, this book aims to describe the filmmaker's day job, that is, the concrete and contingent configurations and modulations of aims and strategies that characterize filmmaking practice, both within and across films. In doing so, it reveals an Altman barely glimpsed in previous critical accounts. This re-examination of his seminal work during the Hollywood Renaissance period of the early 1970s sheds new light on both the films and the filmmaker, reframing Altman as a complex, pragmatic innovator whose work exceeds, but is also grounded in, the norms of Hollywood storytelling. His films of the early 1970s display a classical plus relationship with Hollywood tradition, in which Altman works within and from key Hollywood storytelling norms, while elaborating on and around them in order to also fulfill extra-classical or non-classical aims. Additionally, Altman's aims were not just or even primarily product-oriented. That is, he was not exclusively focused on producing perfectly polished Hollywood films, or even refined embodiments of his cinematic philosophy and overarching worldview. Instead, his objectives were significantly practice-oriented. Altman was focused on achieving and sustaining a particular kind of filmmaking experience that might provide greater opportunities for creative encounters with circumstance. The approach presented here holds significant implications for the study of cinematic authorship and of Hollywood's formal norms, calling into question long-standing assumptions about the subjects and methodology of auteurist criticism and the nature and dynamics of the Hollywood cinema. Displacing the ahistorical, thematic exegesis and impressionistic misdescription that have dominated accounts of Altman's films, this book strives to employ rigorous description, robust analytic frameworks, archival research, and, in places, statistical methods to demystify what are widely agreed to be the defining aspects of Altman's filmmaking. This book's findings require that we rethink the supposition that Hollywood names a cramped and rigid set of norms that Altman defied in the spirit of politically modernist art cinema. In demonstrating that this opposition has been overdrawn, the book provides a clear example of how a filmmaker might work collaboratively and pragmatically within media institutions to elaborate and expand on their sanctioned practices and aims. We misunderstand Altman's work and the creative work of Hollywood filmmakers in general when we insist on describing innovation as opposition to institutional norms. We do the same when we describe those norms as assimilating Altman's innovations instead of acknowledging the more complex range of possible relationships between filmmaking aims and strategies and institutional constraints and opportunities. In many ways, the imperative to manufacture a comprehensive study of a filmmaking career works against comprehension of filmmaking complexity. To insist on that complexity, this study takes a historically bounded approach, focusing on an iconic 6-year and 8-film period ranging from MASH, 1970, to Nashville, 1975. This period has been deemed essential to understanding both the Hollywood Renaissance as a broader movement and Altman's overall authorial profile. A careful re-examination and recharacterization of Altman's body of work in this crucial period provides a critical perspective on assertions about Altman's career both before and after. Such a re-examination also suggests a new model for understanding innovative filmmaking within and across institutions. Reframing Altman as an elaborative filmmaker, revitalizing Hollywood cinema. This book's chapters isolate for analysis the aspects of his authorial profile typically held to define his work and to defy mainstream norms. In each case, careful re-examination discovers Altman to be working situationally to expand the customary aims and capacities of Hollywood style by desanctifying some of its mustier standards and practices. His film's alleged narrative lack, for instance, turns out to be a perversely efficient approach to conventional Hollywood storytelling that integrates and alters rather than assimilates or approximates aspects of art cinema narration. In mathematical terms, Altman's narrative approach is additive rather than subtractive or simply equivalent to Hollywood's standard storytelling. Likewise, the subliminal wandering zooms that supposedly characterize Altman's films during this period prove to be critical mirages. Altman's actual practice is dominated by highly intentional and narratively significant, though also frequently ornamental, uses of the zoom. Similarly, Altman's novel employment of overlapping dialogue is not designed in service to either liberatory or democratic chaos. Rather, Altman and his collaborators' development of this technique consists of technological innovation driven by an elaborative logic. The multiplication of recording tracks expanded the domain of sound design and encouraged more meticulous audio hierarchies rather than more democratic, unplanned uses of sounds. The standard assumptions of expansive on-set improvisation and willful rejection of the screenplay are tested against the archival record to demonstrate that Altman's actual practice involved strategic elaboration. The book's capstone chapter makes use of the redrawn early Altman, established in the previous chapters, to upend critical deployments of earlier Altman's time in industrial filmmaking and filmed television. These media forms have frequently been mischaracterized, most often via a reduction to simple training grounds that Altman suffered or subverted before escaping or graduating into the unfettered auteurism of the Hollywood Renaissance. By carefully establishing institutional contexts and re-examining key works in light of the book's revised account of Altman's later practices, the chapter both illuminates significant continuities of practice and reframes Hollywood's regularly denigrated media siblings as complex creative venues worthy of careful study. Rejection, assimilation, and elaboration. Unlike the majority of book-length work on Altman, then, this is not an authorship study in the traditional sense of grand-scale thematic exegesis and ideological assessment. Instead, it is best understood as aligned with what Stephen Crofts has termed the author-in-production institutions mode of historical authorship study. This mode is most prominently represented by the works of Kristen Thompson and David Bordwell in, for instance, Thompson's Herr Lubitsch Goes to Hollywood and Bordwell's book-length studies of Ozu, Dreyer, and Eisenstein. As Crofts describes it, under this model, the filmmaker is understood as having, of necessity, to work within existing industrial and institutional frameworks and dominant aesthetic conventions. Such an approach is particularly pertinent, given the core questions of this book. How are we to understand the formal design of Robert Altman's work in the context of the early 1970s Hollywood Renaissance period's contested relationship with the frameworks and conventions provided by Hollywood storytelling practice? Answering that question requires a reconsideration of the boundaries of and the creative possibilities within institutions such as Hollywood. Because my focus is on Altman's approach to storytelling, rather than, say, the interdependent but profitably separable question of how Altman negotiated the budgeting and financing of his films during his career, the general framework applied here is that of poetics. Bordwell, a key figure in introducing the poetics approach to media studies, distinguishes it from methods-based approaches by articulating a general domain of inquiry, rather than a master theory. The inquiry into the fundamental principles by which artifacts in any representation medium are constructed, and the effects that flow from those principles. This book synthesizes what Bordwell terms analytical poetics, which studies particular devices across a range of works or in a single work, and historical poetics, which asks about how artworks assume certain forms within a period or across periods, or how and why fundamental principles have arisen and changed in particular empirical circumstances. These principles, more often than not, will be in the nature of norms, those explicit or implicit guidelines that shape creative action and govern conventions. Norms, then, can be described as a delineation and hierarchization of aims, as well as a paradigmatic set of more or less favored options for filmmakers. Bordwell argues that the study of filmmakers and filmmaking practices is usefully guided by two key ideas, proposing that we should assume that the stylistic organization we detect is the result of filmmakers' choices among the alternatives available to them, and that such choices are both enabled and constrained by institutional contexts. Filmmakers are historically situated intentional agents guided by a problem-solution model in which stylistic strategies are best understood as solutions to problems. These problems or goals may be of the filmmaker's own making or institutionally determined. This institutional dimension plays a role in setting the agendas of filmmakers and informing the horizon of what is permitted and encouraged at particular moments. The filmmaker works most proximately within a social and economic system of production, and this involves tacit aesthetic assumptions, some division of labor, and standard ways of using technology. These constitute a mode of filmmaking practice, which both constrains and enables the filmmaker's choices. It is easy to imagine objections to the utility of the institutionally constrained intentional agent model for the study of Robert Altman. To some extent, the rejectionist account depends on the notion of an unshackled, improvisatory Altman, whose films operate, as Robert T. Self puts it, to depict a subliminal reality that recognizes the unspoken and unspeakable dimensions in human interaction, and whose approach resides in lyrical fictions, in metaphoric discourse, and in inexplicable human associations. Yet Self presents Altman as goal-oriented, describing the depiction of subliminal reality as the goal of his movies. Skeptics of the problem-solution model might be persuaded by Altman himself, speaking at a 1975 American Film Institute seminar. The whole business, as one of my cohorts pointed out to me, of what this art is just solving problems. You start out and you say, okay, we're going to do a picture about Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull. Well, shit, how can you do that? You say, well, you could do it in a Wild West show. One problem solved. Whack. Now you've got the basis for the thing. From this point on, until the last day, you're solving a bunch of problems. You set up a goal, and then you start cutting your way through the underbrush to get to it. Indeed, the thrill of on-set problem-solving was one of Altman's major motivators, a key reason why he persisted in filmmaking, and why his output was so prodigious. Stephen Altman, who, beginning with McCabe and Mrs. Miller, regularly worked on his father's films and has had a significant career as a production designer, reported that his father was motivated by the excitement of going to set and dealing with what he's going to get, the battlefield of problem-solving. Bordwell's evocation of empirical circumstances, cited earlier, signals a foundational tenet of poetics, that scholars and critics should invoke concrete evidence that allows others to appraise their claims, whether in relation to historical contexts or the design of creative works. This book's emphasis on close and careful description, then, is not just a corrective to the rampant under-description in previous scholarship on Altman. It is founded on the principle that evidence should be an essential component of critical activity, both to the formulation of theories and the presentation of arguments. Bordwell conceives of poetics as a domain in which the analysis is driven by data and mid-range concepts rather than by abstract or absolute doctrines. It is arguably the adherence to these kinds of absolute doctrines, rather than a commitment to a more dynamic and targeted process of theorizing, testing, and revision, that has led to the overclaiming found in standard explanations of the novel aspects of Altman's storytelling. These accounts tend to apply a formulation in which a novel device is assumed to serve a disruptive function, where overlapping intelligible dialogue automatically undermines narrative clarity, where assumes perspectival distortions necessarily dissolve narrative space. The contextualizing evidence of a particular zoom's configuration or coordination with other aspects of style and narrative situation, or of the careful design of any particular passage of overlapping dialogue, can only get in the way of these kinds of predetermined functional claims. This book, instead, starts from something approximating what Meyer Steinberg has referred to as the Proteus principle, which holds that any effect can be produced by an infinite number of forms, and any form can produce an infinite number of effects. This serves as the basis for Sternberg's functionalist approach, which lends itself to poetics in its deliberate avoidance of predetermined analytic outcomes. Bordwell has incorporated Sternberg's functionalist approach in his own work, arguing that analysts are best served by assuming that identifiable formal features and techniques are not necessarily ends in themselves. They are most fruitfully considered a byproduct of a holistic strategy, an effort after effect. This perspective complements consideration of the role of practice-oriented preferences, like those indicated by this book's account of Altman. It is also usefully supplemented by psychologist J.J. Gibson's concept of affordances, a term that recurs throughout this book. As adopted by media scholars, affordance refers to the notion that, while formal features, works, and contexts, like institutions, are not determinate, they are also not wholly neutral, in that their contours present to those engaged with them both constraints and opportunities for effects and actions. Creative agents like Altman might recognize and capitalize on the full range of affordances provided by institutional frameworks or filmmaking technologies, or they may perceive and act on only a few. Similarly, these creative agent design works whose features present a range of affordances to audiences who may or may not recognize and capitalize on these opportunities. A key point of this revised account of Altman's work is that he recognized how common structures, features, and techniques might be elaborated on and around to create affordances for greater range of experiences than standard Hollywood storytelling. Likewise, Altman managed to negotiate the affordances offered by the technologies and institutions of Hollywood filmmaking, so as to accumulate the authority to fashion both these novel works and the novel production environments he preferred. A historical poetics of Altman's early 1970s oeuvre requires, then, redescribing Altman's formal strategies, reassessing their functions in light of his film's complex design, and through robust functionalist frameworks, and more carefully contextualizing them by situating them in relation to specified institutional norms of aims and practices, both aesthetic and technological. In my discussion of Altman's use of the zoom, I use a qualitative-quantitative approach to construct an account of the immediate context of zoom practices in the work of Altman's early 1970s contemporaries. However, to a large extent, this book relies on established scholarship to constitute the bases for claims about the key underlying modes of film practice. Here the work of David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson, particularly their work with Janet Steiger in the classical Hollywood cinema, film style, and mode of production to 1960, has been extremely useful. Bordwell, Thompson, and Steiger define a mode of film practice as an integral system, including persons and groups, but also rules, films, machinery, documents, institutions, work processes, and theoretical concepts. The authors rely on extensive primary source research and the employment of a large context set of 100 films to provide a carefully argued description of classical Hollywood cinema. In their subsequent work, Thompson and Bordwell develop what have become the standard accounts of classical Hollywood narrative structure and narration, and Bordwell's account of the art cinema as a mode of film practice, though not uncontested, is broadly regarded as authoritative. Their names, then, appear frequently in this book, not just because Bordwell and Thompson are progenitors of the poetics approach to cinematic form, though Thompson frames her particular approach as neo-formalism, but because of the extent, rigor, and influence of their work in relation to the particular modes of film practice relevant to understanding Altman's filmmaking. Indeed, tensions in the literature on Altman, with accounts unevenly split between what I label rejectionists and assimilationists, are based largely in a disagreement about how to place Altman in relation to classical Hollywood storytelling and European art cinema. As previously noted, assessments of Altman's goals and practices tend to cluster at one end of this spectrum of classificatory possibilities, situating Altman as a modernist art cinema auteur and a radical rejectionist of Hollywood's practices. Self's seminal work on Altman frames his feature films as a break from a classical narrative past, embodied in his pivot away from the Warner Brothers B-film Countdown, 1967. After he was removed from that film during the editing process, Altman, according to Self, renounced authorship of its conventional narrative work. In doing so, Self implies, Altman rejected not just Countdown's studio-directed revisions to his work, but Hollywood storytelling itself, turning instead to the norms of art cinema narration. To define art cinema, Self cites the narrational parameters described by Bordwell's The Art Cinema as a mode of film practice: authorial expressivity, objective and subjective realism, and ambiguity, while emphasizing art cinema's tendency to liberate the spatial and temporal systems from subservience to narrative cause and effect. Along these lines, Self claims that Altman's next film, That Cold Day in the Park, 1969, for the first time displays the expressionistic style of art cinema that subverts this subordination. For Self, Altman's follow-up, MASH, confirms his transition from journeyman television director in the classical storytelling tradition to director as auteur in the art cinema, and progenitor of a new American cinema that was modernist in its orientation. Robert Kolker's similarly influential work also labels Altman a modernist filmmaker, emphasizes Altman's rejection of classical Hollywood storytelling, and describes MASH and the films in its wake as radical experiments in decentralization. According to Kolker, what Altman creates is not the conventional structure of a whole analyzed into its parts, but a simultaneity of the whole and its parts, a simultaneity the viewer must always attend to. Altman's films, Kolker proposes, present spectators with an expansive diegetic world that they are then left to sort through on their own. This purported radical openness and freedom, this revolutionarily unstructured depiction of space and time, accomplished through spurning classical Hollywood storytelling in favor of modernist art cinema practices, is central to the rejectionist account of Altman. Its influence is pervasive, disfiguring otherwise invaluable scholarship. Take, for instance, the characterization by Nick Hall, relying on John Belton for poetic support, of Altman's overall approach to the zoom in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, as preoccupied with depth and with making direct transitions into the depth of the mise-en-scène via the zoom. Here, Belton suggests Altman's zoom functions like jazz improvisations, superimposed on a fixed melody. Whether motivated or not, they signal his presence as a narrator. We should, of course, be skeptical of the claim that all zooms function to signal the overt presence of a narrator, though, as Chapter 2 relates, there is within the film a significant internal patterning with certain kinds of zooms, coordinated with key narrative moments, which, like much formal patterning, works both expressively and as a sign of the filmmaker's formal virtuosity. I would agree, though, that a significant number of McCabe and Mrs. Miller's zoom shots are preoccupied with depth, a preoccupation that extends at least as far back as Altman's largely zoom-free work in filmed television on Combat. Hall offers the following example to support and develop his and Belton's claim about the film. See the companion website for a video clip. In McCabe, the zoom towards a banjo player strumming in a gambling parlor is a particularly strong example of the film's many zooms through cluttered and dimly lit interiors. The soundtrack is as confusing as the image. The low, overlapping chattering of the gamblers vies for attention with the banjo. The zoom advances slowly and uncertainly. It finally picks out the banjo player. But like the virtuoso single-take, steady-cam shots often found in later films, part of the visual pleasure of the mobile frame lies in this uncertainty of the final destination. Zooms like these, Belton suggests, create a very flat, dimensionless space which enhances the enclosed, claustrophobic nature of the film. While it seems self-defeating to assert, without explanation, that a zoom into a cluttered mise-en-scène through multiple planes of depth, including a figure who walks across the foreground in medium shot during the zoom-in, suggests a very flat, dimensionless space, there are more substantial problems to be found in the analysis and misdescription of this particular zoom shot. These errors repeat and rely on the rejectionist account's misapprehension of Altman in each of the three dimensions that respectively constitute the subjects of the first three chapters of the book: narrative design, the zoom.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?